There we go. We'll start again. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're glad you're all with us. I'm Alex Pollock of the R Street Institute, and it's a pleasure for Desmond Lachman and me to welcome you to this timely conference on trade deficits and the Trump administration. It goes without saying that debates about trade, tariffs, other barriers to trade, the balance of trade and the balance of payments, and shifts in foreign exchanges, whether the flow of gold in old days or reserves denominated in fiat currencies now, have a long and controversial history in economics and in politics. These debates feature the famous and essential contrast between the interests of producers on one side and those of consumers on the other, the abiding asymmetry and pressures for adjustment between countries with persistent deficits like the U.S. Versus those with persistent surpluses, Germany, for example. And naturally, throughout this is the ubiquitous desire of politicians to get and remain in office, so political economy is certainly the accurate term here. Of course, discussions of trade deficits cannot be divorced from the nature of the international monetary system, the levels of exchange rates, or from the role of the U.S. dollar as the dominant reserve currency, or from the role of the United States as a safe haven for capital. Indeed, we might say, I think, that one of the key things that the United States produces is a social system which does serve so well as a safe haven for savings and capital. We could say that what John Macon liked to call the wealth storage service effectively is traded internationally for net imports. Today we have a truly distinguished panel to address the economic questions of trade deficits amidst the current political forces in play. Each member of the panel is going to speak for about 13 to 15 minutes of opening comments, after which we'll give the panelists a chance to react to each other's ideas or clarify their points. And after that, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we will adjourn promptly at 12 o'clock. Let me introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak. First will be Jeff Frankel, who is the James W. Harpel Professor of Capital Formation and Growth at Harvard University. He also directs the program in international finance and macroeconomics at the National Bureau of Economic Research, where he's on the Business Cycle Dating Committee. Previously, he served on the Council of Economic Advisors. His research interests include international finance, currencies, commodities, financial crises, and monetary issues. Next will be Ann Krueger, Senior Research Professor of International Economics at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, Senior Fellow at the Stanford Center for International Development, and Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution, and was previously First Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, and is a past president of the American Economic Association, and has published extensively on the topic of the day. Our third speaker, Bob Aliber, is Professor Emeritus of International Economics and Finance at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. Bob has written extensively on international finance and international banking, exchange rates, and the global flow of capital and its role in crises. He's the editor of the Reconstruction of International Monetary Arrangements, the co-author of the 5th to 7th editions of the classic Manias, Panics, and Crashes, and the author of The International Money Game. Next will be Claude Barfield, who's a resident scholar at AEI, specializing in international trade policy. His work includes trade policy in China and East Asia, the World Trade Organization, intellectual property, and science and technology policy. And his books include Free Trade, Sovereignty, Democracy, The Future of the World Trade Association, Swap, How Trade Works, and High-Tech Protectionism, The Irrationality of Anti-Dumping Laws. Our last speaker, Desmond Lachman, has been a resident fellow at AEI since 2003, focused on the global macroeconomy. Desmond writes extensively on international economics, including international trade, issues in the euro area, financial crises, currencies, and sovereign debt. Previously, he was Chief Emerging Market Strategist at Solomon Smith Barney and a Deputy Director at the International Monetary Fund, and he has done a great job of organizing this conference. Thank you, Desmond. Jeff, welcome back to AEI, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be leading off this very distinguished panel. I could try to cover all the things that President Trump has said and done in the area of trade that I would view as ill-advised. But we have only 15 minutes each, so I can't really do that. I will say that I don't think anyone but Donald Trump could threaten to cancel a Korea-U.S. free trade agreement in the midst of the worst nuclear crisis that we've had in 55 years vis-a-vis North Korea. But I'm going to stick to 5 trade fallacies, which are up on my slides when it comes up.
I think you have to push your button here. Mm-hmm. Advance it one and see if you're there. There we go.
Very good, thank you. These are fallacies. I mean that they're widely shared. It's not just Donald Trump. Fallacy number 1, U.S. trade negotiators have been out-negotiated by those from other countries. Wrong. Remember the presidential debate where Trump kept interrupting his opponent and saying wrong? So I'm going to do that with an exclamation point. I'm going to do that a few times. In most trade negotiations, and the significant ones in the last 20 years have included most recently TPP, before that NAFTA, before that the Uruguay round, the United States has been able to get most of what it asked for, overwhelmingly. And that's a side effect of being recognized as a leader of the international order, a hegemon. Most countries have benefited from the international order, and we have benefited at least as much as everyone else, and that's been recognized. I think it's important to retain that role as leader of the international order, and one grounds on which I would fault Trump is that he doesn't even seem to think that that's worth trying to keep. But let's get on the subject of how capable our trade negotiators have been versus other countries. Most of these trade agreements have resulted in other countries lowering barriers against our exports much more than we've had to lower barriers against imports, for the simple reason that they started off with high tariffs and other barriers, and we started off with low barriers. More recent agreements have not just had to do with tariffs, but also so-called deeper integration. And here, again, U.S. demands have completely driven the process, and we've gotten most of what we wanted. People might differ about what priority, how important it is, but something on this list is important to most people: labor rights, environment, investor-state dispute settlement, and intellectual property rights. We've been pushing that and achieving most of what we wanted in the TPP, for example. We're supposedly renegotiating NAFTA. So it's a logical question, since Canada and Mexico said, okay, let's do it. And it could be modernized and so on. How would that be done? I have a list that I won't go into of the 5 or 6 different ways that NAFTA could be usefully modernized and expanded. And guess what? They're all in the TPP. My advice there is just to go back to the TPP, or else try to make NAFTA like the TPP. One of the funniest things that Trump has said, this is a direct quote, "The negotiators for Germany have done a far better job than negotiators for the U.S." If you take it at face value, he appears to believe there's such a thing, a job description as trade negotiator for Germany. Of course, Germany outsourced that job long ago to a customs union, namely the European Union. They don't negotiate their own trade policy. Now, I infer what he really means is he observes that Germany runs a large bilateral trade surplus vis-a-vis the U.S. We have a bilateral trade deficit. So let me go on to that. Fallacy number 2, bilateral trade imbalances reflect bad trade agreements. Wrong. Let's say we observe that country A runs a bilateral trade deficit with country C. It generally means that it signifies some combination of 3 causes. And if A stands for America and C stands for China, all 3 of these are relevant. First, country A has a trade deficit overall. Second, country C has a trade surplus overall. That's true of the US and China. And 3, country C needs to earn a structural surplus with countries like A in order to pay for a structural deficit with some other countries, which in this case would be exporters of oil and other commodities. And I'll show you a graph on that in a minute, because all three do describe the situation with China. In terms of the implicit prescription, if we were to stop importing some good, let's say consumer electronics from China, we would import more of them from somewhere else, other Asian countries. It would not affect our overall trade deficit, which is more relevant. And I always tell my students about the folly of thinking that bilateral trade imbalances are important. If I tell the guy who cuts my hair, I don't want to pay you in money, I want to give you a lecture in economics, he doesn't, for some reason, doesn't think that's right payment. He wants me to pay it in money, and then I earn my income from teaching at Harvard, and they pay me, and it all works out just fine. No need to look at bilateral balances. Here's just for China, even though their trade surplus has come down quite a bit, they still have an overall slight trade surplus, a moderate trade surplus, let's say, and they run a trade deficit in primary products and a trade surplus in manufacturing products, and that's part of why they run a surplus vis-a-vis the United States. They run a deficit with commodity exporting countries. Fallacy number 3. A trade deficit indicates the absence of a level playing field. Wrong. There's no correlation, at least no positive correlation, between countries' tariff rates and their trade balances, overall or bilateral, and I've got a graph on that for you in a moment. Rather, trade deficits are macroeconomic phenomena. I'm sure other people on the panel are going to agree with this. They are, in a proximate sense, are influenced by the business cycle, national incomes, and by exchange rates, and in a bedrock, more fundamental sense, are determined by national saving and investment. The U.S. has run current account deficits since 1982 because national saving has been low since 1982, and I'll show you a graph on that. And this is both low private savings compared to our past and compared to other countries, and low public savings, namely budget deficit. We could think of examples of along the way of the famous twin deficits. The period 2001 to 2007 is a good example, when we had big tax cuts, big increases in spending, both military and domestic. So we converted a record trade surplus into a record trade deficit, and that showed up as a fall in national saving, which showed up as a trade deficit. And incidentally, I mean, six months ago, I had the privilege of being on a panel here, and I guess it was December before Donald Trump took office, and many of us thought that he'd be repeating the fiscal policies of Bush and of Reagan, leading to a bigger budget deficit and a bigger trade deficit. As of now, since he hasn't gotten any legislation of note through Congress, it's much harder to predict what will happen there. One of the questions we were asked to talk about is China, Germany, Japan, South Korea. They all run large current account surpluses. Well, the one-line answer for the reason for that is they have high national saving rates. It doesn't have to do with their trade policies. Here's a graph I promised, which is from Carolyn Freund. The horizontal axis is the average tariff rate. The vertical axis is the trade balance. From 0 to up is a surplus, of course, and down is deficit. If there's any relationship at all, it's the inverse one. This is illustrating that it's not the case that countries that are highly protectionist, have high tariffs, have trade surpluses. In fact, the free trade countries have the trade surpluses, and on average, the countries with high tariff protection, for some reason, have trade deficits, probably because of other policies, excessive budget deficits or something. And here's we shouldn't need a graph because it's actually a matter of national savings identity. It's a measure of accounting. It has to hold, by definition, that the current account balance is equal to national saving minus investment. But you can see the graph that the only reason they differ is errors and omissions. Statistical problems are measured in different ways. And the trend up until 10 years ago for the United States was strongly downwards in the current account. There's swings with the business cycle, but overall trend was downwards in the current account, and because it was downwards in national saving. Fallacy number 4, whatever the cause, trade deficits are bad, they subtract from growth. I mean, GDP is, as the freshman students learn, is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. X minus M is the trade balance. Seems like arithmetic that a trade deficit subtracts from GDP. And if you cut the trade deficit, if you improve the trade balance, that adds to GDP and creates jobs. I'm not going to say wrong here. I mean, it's not always wrong. If you have excess capacity in the economy, if unemployment is high, a boost to exports can nicely add to output and employment. But as of now, and as of the last couple of years, we're basically at full employment, I would say. And an increase in exports, if it succeeded in improving the trade balance, would have to pull workers away from other activities and would not add to the overall rate of output and employment. There is another respect in which it's not always wrong. If countries that run chronic current account deficits, that means their international debt is rising. And for normal countries, for most countries, eventually there's a day of reckoning. It starts to impair their creditworthiness. The U.S. seems to be immune from this. I was worried about this for quite a while, but it didn't happen in 2008. And if it didn't happen in 2008, it being foreigners worrying about U.S. creditworthiness, it's going to take a lot more doing before we squander our position as a lead international currency and able to borrow easily at low interest rates on world markets. Well, the important point here to answer fallacy 4 is trade deficits are not always bad news. Trade surpluses are not always good news. So an example of a rise in the trade deficit that was actually good news was in the late 90s. It was accompanied by the longest U.S. economic expansion on record. Unemployment got down even lower than it is today, I think 4.3%. It was the one time when median family income was rising strongly, the second half of the 1990s. Which parenthetically is interesting because so many people, including the Obama administration when they were trying to advance TPP and they would said, well, of course NAFTA, it wasn't so great. This is better than NAFTA. Everyone seems to agree that NAFTA was self-evidently damaging. It is interesting that in the half decade after NAFTA, the United States had the best economic record that we've had in the last 35 years in terms of the longest expansion, strongest growth in productivity, strongest growth in wages, lowest unemployment rate, most widely shared in terms of income distribution and so on. I'm not saying that's because of NAFTA. It was largely because of an investment boom is what was driving that expansion. Brought unemployment as low as 3.8%. What did I say a minute ago?
3.3.
By 2000. And conversely, you show me a country that has a sudden improvement in its trade balance, and I'll show you a country probably that's just gone into recession. That lower income means lower imports. So, and the main example of that, this is the last the Great Recession of 10 years ago. So this is a graph of growth rates. GDP growth rates is the blue line, and the trade balance is the dotted red line. This is from Menzie Chin and Michael Klein at Econofact, is the graph. But of course, the one time when, in recent decades, when the trade balance abruptly fell in half was the period of the Great Recession, when income fell sharply, so imports fell sharply. The point of that is trade deficits, just one illustration, trade deficits are not always bad news. Trade surpluses are not always, or improvements in the trade balance are not always good news.
You got to 5 with 1 minute left.
I'm on my last fallacy, but it's a big one. Trade explains the stagnation in U.S. median family income since the turn of the century. An aggressive trade policy would reduce inequality. Probably wrong. Of course, imports create winners and losers. That seems to be news to some people. But any big change does. If we block imports, that's going to create winners and losers. Take the example of Trump's moves against imports of steel and aluminum, and leave aside the fact that the Section 232 claim that this is a national security issue is flimsy at best. If we did succeed in blocking imports of steel and aluminum, that would raise costs to U.S. manufacturing, produce automobiles, for example. It would raise the cost of living in the United States, and it would hurt our exports. There are various other ways in which blocking imports reduce exports, but since I'm running out of time, I won't name them. But it really is the case that the difference between imports and exports is determined on macroeconomic grounds, and if you block imports, you're going to reduce exports through various channels. Yes, specific industries and localities suffer from import competition, and maybe we hadn't adequately realized how long-lasting and deep that is. But it leaves out, if we're concerned about income distribution, it leaves out two big factors on the plus side. Trade creates export jobs, they pay higher wages than other jobs, and it lowers the price of importable consumer goods, which studies show are disproportionately bought by lower income households. It's hard to say on net whether and how much trade raises inequality or lowers it. It clearly increases the size of the pie. What it does to the distribution of the pie is still an open question. There is debate about it. But it's, I think, pretty clearly not the major reason, the biggest reason for the increase in inequality that we've had over the last 30 years, or for the fact that median family income, even with the most recent figures, even then, has stagnated for the last, since the turn of the century. It's probably less important than technological progress and the fact that education hasn't kept up with the demand for skilled workers and these other factors that I've named. So my last sentence, in my view, you don't actually need to be able to apportion the responsibility for the increased inequality among trade versus technology and other factors. The list of policies that it would be advisable to increase the pie and do it equitably, to raise median family income, is pretty much the same list of policies, regardless of how much emphasis you put on trade versus other factors. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Ann.
Thank you. We're going to be plagued a bit today by, oops, that's Jeff's. How do I get out of Jeff's?
Go.
Huh.
Oh, I've got all these appendices, so you want to go through mine?
I'm trying to.
Just go over it again, actually.
I don't know. I'll let you fill in while I talk.
Let's.
Okay, in any event.
I think just go forward and we'll find Ann in there.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Anyway.
There we go.
Okay, good. I started with the same thing that Jeff did, namely it's a long-standing issue. There's a lot of confusion in the discussion between trade and the current account. The current account is what is important in terms of current earnings versus current expenditures, which includes, of course, services, which are big and in which the U.S. has been running a surplus. And to leave that out of the discussion is a problem because services are one of our big advantages, and anything that is done on the other side is something that's going to hurt services in addition to the things that Jeff talked about. It's always a fallacy to pick one component of something like the trade deficit or the current account deficit, because obviously I can pick one component and you can pick another one, and I can say it's really imports of automobiles and you can say no, it's chemicals, and both of us could be right in the sense that each is about the same size or might be the same size as the deficit. So that kind of thinking, I think, is really erroneous, and it hurts in particular in the United States for manufacturing. And there are a number of reasons why it's bad when we talk about that. But the main one is that a lot of what was counted as manufacturing is now counted as services. And let me explain. In the Census Bureau, everything is classified according to the main activity of what is done. So you go to a factory, and I'll take 3M as an example simply because I happen to know it. But 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, produces lots of goods and services, right? Well, it was mostly manufacturing at first, and so the whole thing was counted as manufacturing. What happened over time was that various things were subcontracted. Subcontracted, for example, for the janitorial services. Subcontracted for the electronic maintenance of the various components in the building, and so on and so forth, fire, security alarms, and now more recently IT and so on. The cafeteria was counted as part of manufacturing earlier until, of course, they subcontracted it, whereupon it became a service. Same people, doing the same things as they were before. But the manufacturing done directly by 3M, as it's counted, went down. So we lost jobs in manufacturing. In fact, some of them went directly into services. In fact, I have a son-in-law who was at 3M, which is why I know it so well, who was there on their payroll, and one day he was in charge of their little electronics repair unit, which wasn't so little, maybe 40 or 50 employees. And one day he came to work and they said, he was called into the front office and we're going to spin you off and we'll give you all your tools, we'll help you out with all this, we'll give you the financing, but now you go and you take work for 3M and anybody else you can find that you want to do the work for. So basically, they still service 3M, but they also do other things. What's wrong with that? If we lost any jobs in the process, actually they gained some jobs because they got some other work too. But we call it something different. And I think it's important to remember that as services become bigger and bigger in the economy, and we talk about, quote, these bad jobs. They're not bad jobs. Business services are big, and many of them are finance, for example, high paying. And not including that in what's going on is a huge mistake. Jeff already mentioned that obviously investment minus savings is the current account deficit. It should better to say it in terms of our expenditures minus our income, but it's the same thing either way, and it's an accounting identity, and we have indeed been expending more on goods and services than we have been buying, which is why we have what's by definition the deficit. It doesn't explain a thing, it's just an accounting identity. Last point. Borrowing from foreigners or importing capital in other ways can be enhancing to growth, or it can be growth reducing. And I have two examples on the slide. Korea in the 1960s, where their average rate of economic growth was 13% per year at the then prices, constant prices, meaning adjusting for inflation then. And while their average rate of growth was 13% a year, they were borrowing 10% of GDP from abroad every year of those 10 years. Every year, not like that, but on average. And of course, the debt to GDP ratio went down because their growth was even higher, because they had so many productive investments as they'd finally figured out how to get incentives right and they'd sorted out their economy, that they could do much more with more capital, so they could afford to pay the 9 or 10% interest on it. And the last calculated rate of return I saw in capital for that decade in Korea was well over 25%. So you could pay 10% on your borrowing and come out way ahead. Now, on the other hand, if instead you were like Mexico in the early 1980s, Mexico had the biggest windfall gain in terms of trade of any country in the world in the 1970s because of huge oil discoveries and, of course, the run up in the price of oil. So they had a big party. And they not only spent all the oil revenue, they spent even more than the oil revenue, so they built up debt and, of course, had no way to pay it. So you can't judge the deficit alone by what it is. You've got to go and look and see why it's what it is, and that's important there. So the deficit's been with us a long time. You see, this is goods and services, and I just put those numbers up. And between 2005 and 2015, they are not quite comparable, and I did not track down why, but there are certainly approximately orders of magnitude. And as you see, it is nothing new. It doesn't have to do with China. It doesn't have to do with Germany in particular. It had a little bit to do with the inflation of the 1970s, which took away our comparative advantage to some extent. We never quite got it back. But on the other hand, it certainly is not something that you can say it started in 2001 or something like that. It started way back. The good growth years that Jeff pointed out in the 90s, and it's been the bad growth years around 2008. Both cases, we have the deficit. It has subsided somewhat as a percentage of GDP in recent years, but it's very much still there, and we are spending more than we earn. There's no doubt about it, and that's what we call a deficit. Third factor is just started going into that. What happened here? Bilateral deficits, which I'm now turning. I put them on the board because, as you can see, we have deficits with almost every region of the world. There are few exceptions. But when we have deficits, what that tells you is that you can't solve it by putting one finger in the dike over here, because the flow will just increase over there, as Jeff said. And the interesting question there is more than that. The interesting question is, suppose that somehow you could negotiate a deal with Mexico, which I hope we cannot do, but where you could, and where they committed to somehow cutting down their imports from the United States. How are they going to do that? They either have to cut back drastically on expenditures and have a recession, which doesn't make much sense, or they have to impose exchange control. How else could they prevent these exports to the United States that they don't want, our imports? How are they going to do it? And we certainly don't want exchange control throughout the world. And yet, asking them to do it asks for one of those two things. Imposing a tariff on Mexican imports alone, leave NAFTA aside, is quite illegal anyway, because under GATT rules, the same non-discrimination. If we did that, we'd have to do it everywhere, in which case the damage to our own economy would be even worse, because we couldn't import the auto parts that we were importing from Mexico or from another country at any lower price than before. It is not even clear that a tariff on Mexican or on all auto parts necessarily would cut down the imports from Mexico. It could even work in reverse. You just don't know. And the idea that this can be done without tremendous damage to the other economies, to our economy, I think is more than just fallacious. One of the things, that even with the efforts to impose countervailing duties by the United States and stuff, has been the degree to which a third country behavior has almost completely wiped out whatever effect it might have. It's very easy to shift sources of various things. It's very rare, and economists have looked at the various efforts to put sanctions on some country. The only case where it looks like it may have been reasonably effective was South Africa. The only case. The reports of the goods going into Iraq via the desert, even in that case, pretty enormous despite all the power of the U.S. It's very difficult to enforce something like this, and it's also ill-advised, and it would damage our economy probably as much as the other one. So you have those. Then we go to all this. It's WTO illegal. Our companies would be less competitive. If Japanese companies can get auto parts from the cheapest source, say Mexico, and we cannot, how are our companies going to be less competitive, not more? So we'll be less competitive in autos. We'll probably want to import more autos. So then we want to import tariffs on them. How far does it go? Where do you stop? And the third country effect, and is it enforceable at all? Or do you get smuggling and other things going as a result when you start this kind of thing? I don't know the answer, but I certainly know it's a bad idea, and I know it will not correct the deficit. Okay, what about jobs? As Jeff mentioned briefly, exports create jobs. And they create jobs not only directly but indirectly. And again, I will use imports because Japanese exports of automobiles to the United States increased markedly in the 1970s, as everybody knows. They increased markedly for a variety of reasons, and I won't go into those. But with cheaper cars, the small car, which the American companies at that time would not make, with the cheaper cars, there were more cars. Teenagers began getting cars which they didn't have before. Families that had previously been one car became two car. Families with two cars became three car, and so on and so forth. What did that do? Well, yes, we imported the Japanese cars, but what about service stations? What about auto mechanics? What about the longshoremen who imported the cars? If you think of the jobs associated with the Japanese export of cars, that offset a considerable amount. And in fact, they say something like 1 out of 9 jobs in the U.S. is related to the industry, including production and including servicing. Well, 1 in 9 is a big number, but of those, production is a very, very small part. Most of the jobs are in the others. And if we have more cars on the road and so on and so forth, that's good. Of course, they're also safer, and that may be a bad thing because there aren't so many jobs in hospitals. I mean, I don't think so, but you might argue that way along the same lines if jobs are the only thing you care about. How am I doing on time?
You're doing well. You've got about 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. There are a lot of indirect effects, not only the ones I mentioned. All the service industries, financial services, and so on and so forth. Much of our service industries are based on businesses doing business abroad, and the dollar being the unit of international currency. You can't forget that. What do we do? Well, this is going to sound heretic, especially at AEI, but I have come to the view that trying to talk about jobs and exports is foolish, not only for the reasons Jeff suggested, and the best numbers I've seen suggest that between 85 and 90% of job displacement is probably due to a technical change rather than to trade. But having said that, there's a second component to that, and that is the job turnover in the United States is about 20 million jobs per year. And 20 million jobs per year is a lot larger than anybody can possibly attach to any kind of trade problems that we may have had, even if you ignore technical change. It's just the whole of the thing couldn't be that. It just isn't comparable. We have a very fluid, very flexible labor market, which is a good thing. What should we do? I think we should provide more support, basically, for people who are without work. Some of the European countries, and Denmark seems to be in the lead, and I'm no expert on this, but I try and follow a bit, have adopted policies called flex security. Any company is going to lay off workers notifies not only the workers at the appropriate time, but they notify the equivalent of the Labor Department. I'll just call it that. The Labor Department has job centers everywhere, and workers who lose their jobs show up at these centers. They not only apply for unemployment compensation, they also are advised as to what their skill set is, where there are jobs, where they are provided finance if indeed the jobs are in Copenhagen and they're in Aarhus or vice versa. They are given other support. They are told okay, you don't have the qualifications now because you're missing that training. They are sometimes subsidized in training as necessary. And the Danes have cut the duration of unemployment and the hardcore unemployment rather substantially. They also have a very low unemployment rate overall. They don't worry about why the job was cut. And you can't. Suppose that a company goes out of business somewhere in the United States. Why did it go out of business? Well, probably in part because of poor management, because some other companies survived, probably in part because of technical change, maybe something else came along, probably in part because of imports. So let's say that all three contributed. Let's say a third each, just to make it simple, okay? Let's line up all the workers who lost their jobs. Please tell me which third lost their jobs on account of trade. No way. No way you can do that. And yet, why do we want to treat workers who lost their jobs for one reason any differently from another? Why don't we do whatever we think by way of a social safety net more generally? I could go even further along this line, but I'll get well beyond this topic. But to treat workers as our job loss from trade as something special and different doesn't make sense because you don't know who lost it, you don't know the indirect effects, and you don't know who among those who lost it, even within a firm, lost it because of trade or otherwise. So I would argue that we've got to move away from the notion of trade adjustment, and I think trade economists have been guilty of saying this, because, politically it's so sensitive, you've got to do this. If we've got to do something, why not support all the workers and give them time? And by the way, in the Danish case, if they don't look for work, they get cut off from their unemployment compensation very fast. And you can do that if you've got a system that works, which you can't do in our system quite as easily. So come along, okay, we'll just give more unemployment comp. And there's evidence that prolongs the length of unemployment. It also helps people. It's not an all bad thing, but it does prolong unemployment, raise the costs, and probably people don't like getting unemployment compensation as much as they would their next job. So let me just finish quickly because Alex asked this question. Obviously, incentives to increase savings, both public and in private, are important. Obviously, productivity increasing measures are important because they would obviously increase our comparative advantage, and their deregulation and so on are clear. Tightening fiscal and monetary policy, if you think we've got excess savings or excess investment, I'm not sure we do. I take Alex's point about other countries are using our dollar as a financial service, but if you do want to reduce it, that's the way to do it, not to do the bilateral deficits and so on. The IMF tried in the 2000s to bring together the major 6 surplus and deficit countries to get them to agree on a coordinated package so that the burden of adjustment, which everybody said they wanted, but they would be split between surplus and deficit countries. Everybody agreed on how much the cuts should be, no problem there. But of course the Chinese thought the U.S. should adjust, and the U.S. thought the Chinese should adjust, and so on and so forth. There was no way and no mechanism to get the agreement split. So in that process, nothing happened. It may come about again that we get to a point where there can be some mutual agreement as to, okay, you've got excess demand in your economy, we've got excess supply, we can find a way to do it. So far, that has not been done, and I'm not optimistic until the next time we come to some crisis point. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ann. We're going to go to Bob Aliber. Bob.
Thank you. Thanks to Desmond, the organizers. Great to be here. For 100 years, I taught second-year MBAs at Chicago. And at the beginning of every class, I would hand out a blue book and ask the students to write down the answers to 2 questions. The first question, I asked them to identify the course that they had taken in the previous quarter or the previous year that they'd gotten the most out of. And then I asked them to write down the key ideas in that course. And I gave them a couple of minutes. And then I pointed to Cole in the front row and said, Cole, how many ideas did you write down? There'd be a long pause, and Cole would say, 2. So I'd go to the board and I'd say, Cole, what was tuition for the course? He would say $6,000, so we'd put the fraction 6,000 over 2, $3,000 per idea. And then I would sort of say, Cole, did you study, how many hours, etc. 100 hours, 100 over 2, 50 hours an idea. I've got 13 minutes and 3 ideas. And so the first idea is that the trade deficit, and I want to thank Ann for introducing the distinction between the trade deficit and the current account deficit. When I say trade deficit, I mean current account deficit. It's just a convenience. The trade deficit, now 4% of U.S. GDP, has caused us to lose 1 million to 2 million jobs. It's a non-trivial number. It is just a very, very large number. I come from northern New England, and when I drive through towns like Enfield and Claremont, I could cry to see the devastation in these communities. So that's my first idea, and I'll come back to that. The second idea gets what has caused the trade deficit. So we come to the savings investment imbalance that both Jeff and Ann. In here, I'm going to introduce the distinction between crowding out and crowding in. If I listen to my colleagues on this panel, I hear that there's a shortage of U.S. savings, maybe. But maybe there's an excess supply of foreign savings. And maybe the foreign savings is coming into the United States and driving up the price of the U.S. dollar and having an impact on our savings rate. So that is the crowding out, crowding in distinction. And the third idea that I want to get to gets involved in policies. And it gets involved in the exchange rate system. We have an exchange rate system in which Mrs. Watanabe and Mrs. Zhang savings and investment habits lead to changes in the price of the dollar of 20%. We're allowing short-term money movements, plays on the leads and lags to drive the real exchange rate, and this is not a way to run a stable monetary system. This is the cause of instability. So let me come now to my first idea. How big is the job loss? And I'm really going to punt on the numbers, so somebody else can do it, one of Jeff's PhD students. But if you think that sort of value added per worker in U.S. manufacturing is $500,000, that's a very, very large number relative to the wages. You'd come to the conclusion that a $100 billion, a $1 billion trade deficit would lead to a loss of 20,000 jobs, and an $800 billion trade deficit would lead to a loss of 1,600,000 jobs. The numbers are very large, and we need to understand how large the job loss has been because of the trade deficit. We may not be able to identify who has lost the jobs, but we would all, I think, share the conclusion that if essentially the trade deficit were to gradually decline, employment in manufacturing, broadly conceived, would increase. Let me come now to my second issue. Incidentally, the trade deficit begins, as Jeff said, in the early 1980s. And it's associated with a change, I would say, in the international monetary system and with the large variability that we've had in the price of the US dollar. In the first half of the 1980s, the price of the US dollar went up 50%, a very large change. You will remember, I was then in the Midwest. The Midwest was being hollowed out. The Iron Belt became the Rust Belt, and that was essentially part of the adjustment to the change, the increase in in the price of the U.S. Dollar. Now, when I think about the crowding out, crowding in distinction, I'm reminded of that question that must have been in this room or its earlier counterpart in the early 1990s, when somebody said, how would the U.S. Treasury finance its fiscal deficit if the BOJ weren't willing to buy U.S. dollar securities? So let's go through that. If the Bank of Japan did not buy U.S. dollars, the price of the U.S. dollar would be lower. The price of the yen would be higher. If the price of the yen were higher, Japan would have a smaller trade surplus, and in that case, the U.S. would have had a smaller trade deficit. If our trade deficit had been smaller, our fiscal revenues would have been higher. So our savings investment imbalance in the United States is not independent of the foreign demand for U.S. Dollar securities. Now, when I look at what I would call the cumulative U.S. trade deficit since 1980, it's about 14,000 billion. And I then have tried to identify which countries have the counterpart trade surpluses. And I have sort of three broad categories. One category of sovereign wealth funds, the Norways, the Chiles, the Singapores, the United Arab Emirates. Their accumulated savings is 7,000 to 8,000 billion. They've essentially are involved in a consumption smoothing over time. And so they have exceptionally high savings rates, and a large part of their savings go abroad, and a significant part of their savings leads to an increase in the U.S. trade deficit. A second part will be a second component of the countries that have had large trade surpluses of countries that have excess, what I would call excess reserve accumulation. What is happening in Singapore is mindless in terms of the savings, the cumulative private and public savings rate, a current account surplus of 15 to 20%. For over 30 years. Other Asian countries have extraordinarily high savings rates and extraordinarily high levels of foreign investment. And then we have countries that are large reserve accumulators. I mean, China, I find sort of fascinating. It's the only poor, rapidly developing country, an amazing contrast with South Korea. South Korea grew rapidly and imported foreign savings. China grew rapidly and exported a non-trivial part of its own savings. Now, let me come now to what I would call the policy observations. What's my objective? I want to stabilize the real price of a currency. I do not want Mrs. Zhang and Mrs. Watanabe's play on the leads and lags to lead to massive changes in the real price of the dollar. This gets to the comment on the reserve currency role of the dollar, or if you want, on the depth, breadth, resiliency of U.S. financial markets. And so what I would be willing to do is to essentially adopt a version of the Tobin tax. Jim was one of my teachers at Yale when we were playing tennis one day, and he was complaining, it ain't fun to have a tax named after you. So we'll call this a version of the Tobin tax, and when the price of the dollar gets high, as it did in 83 and 84, or as it did in 97 and 98, or when the current account surplus becomes large, That's my, I want to minimize the surges in the current accounts, sorry, I misspoke. I want to minimize the surges in the U.S. capital account surplus. And let me speak briefly on that. We're now in the contractive phase of the fourth dollar cycle since 1980. Each of these dollar cycles is at an expansive phase and a declining phase. The expansive phase leads to brilliant performance of the U.S. economy because of surges in consumption spending, the decline in the savings rate. And then we go through into the contractive phase. The price of the dollar declines, the capital account surplus declines, and that ends up with a recession. The 1990s was a marvelous expansive phase due to the surge in the U.S. capital account surplus. Peaked in April of 2000. The inflow slowed, the price of the dollar fell significantly, and U.S. stock markets fell significantly. The expansive phase of the third cycle begins in 2003. It peaks in the fourth quarter of 2006. We move into the contractive phase. House prices begin to fall, and we end up with the most severe recession ever due to the Mrs. Watanabe and Mrs. Zhang's cross-border currency movements. So I want to tax foreign purchases of U.S. dollar securities when the price of the U.S. dollar gets high. And I want to essentially increase the tax over time, secularly, to charge for the money housekeeping services, because the burden of providing those services are on the millions of people who've lost their jobs because of the increase in the U.S. trade deficit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Claude.
Thank you. When Des and Alex asked me to participate in this panel, I pointed out that by the time you got to me, my comparative advantage, which was not large anyway, would have been lost totally, because you've had three, and I'm sure Des is going to continue this, a fourth lesson in the fallacies, as Jeff put it, of worrying about trade deficit. So I suggested I'm going to maybe go in another direction a little bit and talk a little bit about the United States trade position with China and trade policy toward China, with which we have the largest not current account deficit, but product deficit. And so I'm going to be very specific, and I should say that some of you may have seen, most people are here have been in or live here in Washington. So I think about 3 or 4 weeks ago, Bob Samuelson, the economics writer for the Washington Post, wrote a piece in which he said, on trade, Trump, and by example also Bennion, got one thing right, and he said that was about China. And I guess the theme that I'll be following through with this morning, and I invite feedback from my fellow panelists, because this is in the spirit of what am I getting wrong here? Why shouldn't we do this? The theme would be kind of the evolution of a reluctant trade hawk or interventionist. And let me explain what I'm talking about here. I'm also not, I'm basically going to, my examples will be mostly involved with what would be loosely called our high-tech sectors, and particularly high-tech electronics, information and communications technology, and internet-related companies. I'm not particularly concerned about steel and aluminum, as the Trump administration is. And I should say that in my writing since the Trump administration has come in, and even before, I don't know whether I don't think I've agreed with almost anything that they've done. So I don't start out as much of a Trump supporter and very much a critic. But I think the situation with and I also have, to jump to something I'll be saying at the end in policy, have always resisted, under the tutelage of people like Ann and Jagdish Bhagwati and others, reciprocity. Strict reciprocity with other nations in terms of trade policies. all through the 1980s. I thought that the ideas that were coming from the Congress about strict reciprocity for Japan were a mistake. For reasons I'll go into, I just think that China is different because of its size and because of where they are putting their resources and the way they are putting their resources. And let me just talk a little bit about what it is like for the moment to be a Google or an Apple trying to compete in China. At the moment, almost half of the 20 most popular websites around the world are blocked in China. And that specifically hits U.S. companies, which have a competitive advantage certainly in this area. It includes the Googles, the Facebooks, the Microsofts, Twitter, and also outside the New York Times, the economists, not companies involved in it. But the point is that these companies in this sector right now, and since mostly this goes back to half a decade, in some cases a full decade, have been blocked from competing in Chinese markets. In the Chinese market. Now, the Chinese say that these blocks are because of public morals. They don't want, there's some information they don't want, or national security. But there is a very clear, if you go back and look at the history here, there is a very clear industrial policy aspect. When the Chinese blocked Google, it was just at the time that Baidu was coming up. When you look at Qualcomm, you also see the same kind of competition with Tencent and other Chinese companies. And so while the Chinese claim that this was an industrial but this was just something about public morals and about security, which is allowed under the WTO, and I'll come back to that, clearly when you look at actually what happened, there were other things going on here. And this has increased under Xi Jinping since 2012. We just had the Chinese intervene to stop virtual private networks, forcing one of the final outlets that people could get to the internet to be closed or under government control. So you've got that particular aspect. The other thing is that the Chinese are mixing, and what makes it difficult in terms of trade policy, security policy very clearly with economic policy, even beyond the closing of the internet. The new cybersecurity and national security laws, the national security law was passed 2 years ago. Cybersecurity law, I think, just came into effect last summer. Clearly have major economic implications. The definition of security, both cybersecurity and broader national security, is sweeping. It includes all kinds of economic activities, agricultural activities, manufacturing, services. Almost any aspect of the Chinese economy has been swept up into the definition of their definition, at any rate, of security. Now, this has implications because of under the cybersecurity and the national security laws, there are certain obligations that companies assume, both Chinese companies, I would say, and foreign companies, but it's particularly important for foreign companies. That includes such things that technology must be controllable and secure. The companies also have an obligation under these laws to help and assist the government in all kinds of ways technologically, in terms of encryption, in terms of source codes, in the name of national security or cybersecurity. Now, as is typical of Chinese laws, the language is sweeping, but the administration is still being worked out. So the companies, whether it's an Apple or a Google or whichever, or even a Chinese company like Huawei, for instance, still don't know what the ultimate obligations are going to be. And so while they do know that they have new obligations, they are gradually coming down, with the Chinese government claiming, well, we're not going to do this in an anti-competitive way. At the same time, they're moving forward in ways that will be anti-competitive and will hurt. I'm not just talking about U.S. companies. I'm talking about all foreign companies which are investing in China. I should say that beyond that, if we look at the larger picture, and there's nothing new about what I'm saying, and most of you have probably read this at some point, the Chinese are very, very clear about their intent. They don't tie the cybersecurity law or the national security law to this. But the Chinese are publicly saying that made in China 2025 means that it's, to the degree that they can do so, they are going to substitute domestic technology for foreign technology. And whether you're talking about the cybersecurity law or the national security law or the other domestic regulations that are being put in place, it is all in the name of this particular goal. And as I say, the Chinese are very, very clear about that. Now, finally, what should we do about this? And there are a variety of possibilities. And I agree with those who are arguing, for instance, that we certainly should move forward very quickly with a bilateral investment treaty with the Chinese, which would introduce some regulations, which would stop some or to remove some barriers. The problem I see, though, is I don't think there's any chance in hell the Chinese government today, Beijing, is going to agree to the kind of detailed and meaningful reduction of barriers that would come in what would be a vital bilateral investment treaty. So I just don't see that happening. A second thing that's been argued, and I agree with it, if we could do it and should do it, is to use the World Trade Organization. I'll come back to one example that I think that would be good. But the problem you face there is that for the sectors that I'm talking about, for the internet-related companies and sectors and information technology, WTO laws, by and large, don't or barely cover the kinds of issues that come up. The last, we'll point out to everyone, which is not obvious, but you never think about it maybe in terms of, okay, what kind of case will we do? The last negotiation of the WTO ended in 1995, which was even the pre-dawn, you might say, of the internet. So you could stretch, and you might be able to stretch some obligations that came under the Telecommunications Services Agreement, but it's going to be, it'd be a stretch. The one case that I would argue that the United States should move forward in, and I think there is some possibility, and I think we ought to take the chance, I don't think we'd absolutely win, is a direct attack on the Great Firewall, the great censorship wall that China has put around the country. There's some indication from earlier WTO cases, one of which the United States lost correctly, in that the panels in the appellate body of the WTO would say the following: all right, to China as an example, all right, if there's a New York Times article that you find offensive to your people, or that somehow some bit of information that's in a New York Times piece or The Economist or something on Facebook, you can certainly remove that. But what you can't do under WTO law is then sweep all of the New York Times off of the web, or all of Facebook, because that violates an obligation to have the least protectionist means of getting to your goal, even under national security or with public morals. So I think we ought to do that. But I don't think that takes us very far. And that gets me finally to the reciprocity issue. And I should say this, I'm distrustful of the Trump administration being able to pull this off with any precision. They will probably tie it. I think Mr. Ross is going to China in November. He's going to tie it back to something that, as these panelists have pointed out, is nonsense, to doing something about the trade deficit. What I'm arguing may or may not affect the trade deficit, but we know if there's going to be other things that actually that will govern that. But still, I mean, having said that, I do think that I do support the administration going forward with bilateral negotiations with the Chinese, and really doing it very specifically. These particular issues, what you're arguing that we have to have a partner, the definition you have of cybersecurity, we will not live with. And here's where we get to the nub of the matter, I would invoke reciprocity not on the trade side, but on the investment side, where I think WTO rules are less, I think, rigorous. In fact, there are very few investment rules in the WTO, and ratchet up the process there. Whether it would work, I do not know. But I don't think the United States could stand still, and this is a kind of new position for me in terms of other countries, in terms of trade policy. I should say one final thing that I forgot to skip over to end, and that is there is the movement in the Congress, which I support to the degree that I know what the legislation will be, to expand the CFIUS process, the foreign investment process by which we screen foreign direct investment in the United States in terms of national security grounds. I think Senator Cornyn's bill, to the degree that I know, that I understand it, is an expansion that I think actually CFIUS is working pretty well. If I had my druthers, I wouldn't touch it. But there's a pressure to do something, and the pressure is to do something because of China. The worry that I have in the Congress is that in trying to get at China, the Congress will just go overboard and really do things that really hurt foreign direct investment beyond China. I think what's there now is probably not that bad. He does expand in his bill the CFIUS process to joint ventures, which I think gets the process into more difficult territory where it's not really possibly competent. But I think if we can get away with that kind of amendment, I would be quite happy. And let me end by saying, again, to my fellow panelists, come back. Where am I? What am I missing here, and where have I got wrong? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claude.
Got it wrong.
Desmond.
Thank you, Alex. At this stage, having heard three professors talking about trade, there's nothing much left for me to do. I'm really tempted to try to put the Trump case, but I'm afraid that if I try to do that, my university might ask me back for my diploma. So I'm not going to do that.
Peter Navarro still has his.
I went to a university that's a little bit more strict with the standards. What I'm wanting to do is just talk about four things. First, I want to talk a little bit about the myths that Jeff spoke about so well, in which I agree. I'll be very brief on that. The second thing I want to talk about is what seems to me basic inconsistencies in the Trump approach to the trade deficit, and I'll elaborate on that a bit, that he's wanting to use import restrictions, but he's got a different kind of budget policy, and it doesn't all square. The third point I want to talk about a little bit is, what I call the United States exorbitant privilege, and it comes to Bob's point about capital flowing into the United States. And the last thing I want to do is just raise a question as to whether the dollar might be losing its safe haven status. So just in terms of the myths, I've got the same two charts as Jeff put up, but I think that they're worth repeating. This clearly shows that there's absolutely no correlation, or if there is a correlation, a negative correlation. So if you've got 180 countries that over a 14-year period, those with the high tariffs didn't necessarily have low trade deficits and vice versa. So this is absolute nonsense that going the tariff route is the way to bring the trade deficit down. The second point, correctly as Jeff noted, is that it looks like there's a negative correlation between trade deficits and economic performance, that when the economy is really doing very well, when it's strong, you're sucking in the imports, you're therefore riding a big trade deficit. Likewise, when the economy is weak, that's the time you've got a trade surplus. But what this tells me is that the Trump administration is totally misguided to make the trade surplus or the trade deficit an objective of economic policy. It's only an intermediary stage. What you should be focusing on is what is your GDP growth like, what is your employment growth. Those are the targets that they should be looking at, and not what the trade balance is. The question now as to the inconsistencies of Trump's policies is that I too learned about this famous Keynesian equation on aggregate demand, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m, and you're left with an identity that tells you, if you just rearrange that equation, that a current account balance is the result of the difference between a country's savings and its investment rate. If it's got very high savings rate and low investment, it's going to have a big trade surplus. If it's got very high investment and low savings, it's going to be running a very big trade deficit. And as Anne mentioned, just looking at the trade deficit, you can't tell whether it's good or bad. You've got to ask what is really driving it. If it's being driven by very high investment, that is a good trade deficit. It means the country's going to grow, it's going to be able to repay the debt later on. What we worry about is when the trade deficit is the result of very low savings. And what you of course find is, like Anne mentioned, those countries that have very good trade performances, that they're running very big current account surplus, for instance, are the countries generally that have got very high saving rates. So China, Germany, Korea, those are the ones that really stand out, and those are the ones that are giving us problems. So let me mention why I'm really very concerned about the whole Trump approach to trade, is that what they're saying is that if we have import restrictions, if we go after currency manipulators, if we tear up trade agreements, that's really going to solve the trade deficit side. What the saving investment equation is telling you is that immaterial on what they do on that score, you're still going to be running a trade deficit if your savings falls way short of your investment. My concern with the Trump administration is that what they're doing is, at the same time that they're pursuing this misguided policy on import restrictions, what they're doing is they're proposing a budget policy that would be very expansionary. So what they're proposing is a very large unfunded tax cut. They're proposing very big infrastructure expenditure. What one would assume is that that is going to give rise to a larger budget deficit. If you have a larger budget deficit, it means that the country is saving less. If the country is saving less, and at the same time, through your deregulation policy and all the rest, you're getting investment to pick up somehow, you're going to be getting a trade deficit that is going to be widening rather than narrowing. And my fear is that what they do, if they manage to get their policies implemented, which is another big question, but if they do that, then what they're going to find is that even though they put on the import restrictions, because they're following a budget policy that is wrong to bring down the deficit goes up, they'll then double up on the import restrictions. And that is really a key source of my concern. Let me go to the second point about the exorbitant privilege. That was something that was made popular in the 60s by first Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and then de Gaulle. What they did is they complained that the United States had this exorbitant privilege in that the dollar was the reserve currency, everybody wanted to hold the dollar, that capital came into the United States, which meant that the United States could go on indefinitely consuming more than it produced because people wanted to bring the money into the United States, and that's essentially how we were financing the Vietnam War. The truth of the matter is, as Bob was alluding to, is that if you've got a freely floating system, if you've got a positive capital account, that necessarily means you're going to be having to have a deficit in your current account. The balance of payments has to balance. You're not intervening, so capital's coming in. You're going to have a trade deficit. If you try to stop that by putting on import restrictions and the like, what you're likely to do is to cause the dollar to appreciate further, because in the exchange market you've now got more dollars coming in, so your exchange rate appreciates. That could cause the capital to flow further, so you're not really going to solve that problem. So what I come to the conclusion of this is, so long as you've got a huge amount of savings coming into the United States is going to be running a current account deficit. And what one would also be looking at is that the correction of the current account deficit from the United States point of view is that the United States should be trying to save more to finance its investment, but at the same time, I've got sympathy for the United States in saying that a country like Germany, which is now running an 8% of GDP current account deficit, this is the surplus. This is the largest surplus in both absolute terms. It's around about $300 billion, as well as in terms of GDP. In fact, something like 3 times the level that China has. That there's an obligation on the Germans to do their part. You know, they really cannot hide behind the fact that they don't have a currency, the ECB's running their currency, or that they've got a debt break on their budget, that they can't do anything about the budget. You know, this just happens. The current account just somehow happens. I think that there's responsibility on their side as well. And going to Anne's point, you know, that what you really need to do is you need to get some kind of coordination of policies in order to lead to address those imbalances. So let me make the last point I want to make, and it's something that's been bothering me. It's about the dollar's performance over the past year. You know, since Trump came in, the chart will show is that since he's assumed office, the dollar has fallen by round about 12%. And this raises a question in my mind, is that at the start of the year, what people thought is that the United States was far further on the cycle in terms of recovery. Therefore, what it meant is that the Fed was going to be starting to raise interest rates to reduce the size of its balance sheet, you know, begin selling off some of the bonds, you know, which all of this is happening at a time that the Japanese and the Europeans were printing money like it was going out of fashion. You know, they were still engaged in quantitative easing in a big scale. So for that reason alone, you would have expected the dollar to strengthen. The dollar, in fact, weakens. A second thing that you would have expected the dollar to strengthen from past behavior is that once geopolitical tensions arise around the world, you know, once you've got a problem, you might be creating these tensions, but nevertheless, the geopolitical tensions, once those occur, if you've got problems in Korea, you've got problems in Russia, you've got problems in China Seas, you've got problems in the Gulf, generally what happens is money comes into the United States, pushes up the dollar. So those two considerations just raise a question in my mind whether something might not be going on, that the United States is in the process of losing its allure as the place to bring money in times of trouble. And if that is the case, we really do have a problem, because then the adjustment is really going to be forced on us, you know, just on this notion of if the capital doesn't come into the United States, like any other country, we're going to be obliged to reduce our deficit. And then what we're going to find out is that when that occurs, we really aren't going to no longer enjoy the option of consuming more than we're producing. We're going to have to tighten our belt. Living standards are going to go down because we're going to be absorbing less than before when this 3% of GDP of current account deficit is forced out. So, you know, this might all occur, but it won't be occurring in a organized, proper fashion. It could be fairly disruptive, and it'll be occurring not because of President Trump, but despite him.
Thank you, Desmond, and thanks to all the panelists for 5 not only expert but really interesting presentations. I want to give the panelists each a chance to either react to something somebody else said, or add more ideas, or even just repeat something if you want to. Maybe about 2 or 3 minutes each. We'll just go down in the same order, and if you get to 3 minutes, I'll let you know. Jeff.
I'll say one quick thing about each of my excellent fellow panelists. First, with Claude, I agree that IPR, intellectual property rights, is an area where the U.S. has some valid complaints against China. Second, Bob, we've all said that the current account is a macroeconomic phenomenon. It isn't just U.S. national saving and investment. He's quite right that national saving in other countries matter as well. I already mentioned very high saving rates among the major current account surplus countries. And in the case of some countries like Singapore and maybe China and Germany, I'm willing to say that saving is too high. But it's really too high for their own good. And the thing is, every country gets to choose the macro policies that they think suit them, whether rightly or wrongly. And the great advantage of a floating rate country, as a floating rate system, as Milton Friedman told us long ago, is it facilitates each country running the policies that it thinks suits its situation. That doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't, and we do, talk about these issues in international fora like the IMF and the G7 and the G20, and make deals like the Plaza Accord and all that. I don't see an ability to do that today. I mean, for Germany, it's really their partners in the European Union that need to bargain with them to cut down their fiscal austerity. I'm going to build on something she said. She sort of pointed at the downsides of trade adjustment assistance, and how can you tell when a worker's lost, even conceptually, let alone in practice, when a worker's lost his or her job for trade versus something else due to technology. That's right, but I would add to it, why exactly do we care? Don't we want to provide the same safety net or help workers, regardless of whether they've lost their jobs due to trade or technology? And as she said, unemployment insurance has a problem that it provides a disincentive to go back to work. And I think the answer is wage insurance, which provides compensation while you're out of jobs. But if you go back to work at a lower wage than the job that you lost, the government makes up the difference. And that is actually, it was proposed by President Obama in one of the State of the Union messages. It's on my list of 10 policies that we should be doing for shared prosperity and to make sure we don't leave the median worker behind. Regardless, and my list of 10 is fiscally balanced. That wage insurance would cost some money, but there's other places to make up for it. Lastly, Desmond, it is a question that's come up this year. Is the U.S. losing the U.S. dollar losing its safe haven status? And it's well worth asking the question. Based on things we've been doing lately, and in the longer term, you might think that that would happen. That the dollar would lose its special safe haven status, but so far I don't think so. I don't think it's happening. It's true that the dollar has depreciated quite a bit since January, but there's a pretty ready explanation for that. Last year and the year before, the U.S. was expanding and growing more rapidly than our major trading partners, and that appears to have reversed this year. And that, briefly, I think, is a major reason. It's true, I think, that geopolitical risks are huge and other risks are huge, but the VIX is really low. All indications are we're in a risk-on environment, and the risk-on assets, like equities most notably, which are at highs, and currencies like the Australian dollar and the Chinese renminbi and the emerging market currencies, they're all up, and the safe haven currencies are down. It's not just the dollar, the Swiss franc is down as well. So I don't think that's changed.
Thank you. Anne?
Lots and not much time. For Bob Aliber, a couple comments. The first one being your calculation of lost jobs. But I think
Talk to in the mic, please.
I thought. Oh, sorry. Okay. And your calculation on lost jobs, by my reckoning, you said 1.6 million jobs were lost. We already have an unemployment rate of 4.3%. How much lower do you think it would go? I would tend to think that we lost some jobs, of course, but we gained them elsewhere, and that we're pretty much at full employment, and that obviously there might be more jobs in tradables relative to non-tradables or vice versa, but that there's a net loss, I find hard to believe. There are pockets of concern. There are cities or areas where there have been difficulties. But again, I go back to we want uniform treatment of all people who are in that situation, not simply on account of that. On the Tobin tax, I have questions as to what would you tax? Would you tax any capital inflow and outflow, including FDI, or not? If you include everything, then you've got a problem. I think but money is fungible even there, and I doubt seriously that you could do very much. U.S. companies hold lots of assets overseas, as we know. It would be very difficult to make much of a difference in that regard for a whole variety of reasons. The enforcement costs would be huge, and the benefits, I suspect, would be small, if not negative. And so money is fungible after all. And to cut down on transactions in such a way that you do enough to make a difference is going to mean to make enough difference so that there's going to be an incentive for smuggling, for evasion, and that kind of thing. Many developing countries have been there. I don't want the U.S. to be a developing country like that. So I guess I'd be I'll build on Jeff's point for a minute, and that is that I wouldn't go wage insurance. I'd go basic income guarantee or basic thing, which is a big departure for me. But I would do it only if subsidies and other measures were cut off at the same time, so that you had a basic income guarantee for everybody. The rich can pay their taxes on it, and the poor can have it. And then we don't get into farm subsidies. We don't get into all these other things. One thing, everybody. It is no more costly than the wage insurance, might even be less. And meanwhile, there it is. And you don't get into all these discussions about what did trade do, and we're going to put a tax on this, that, and the other thing. To me, I've become convinced that a uniform income subsidy to everybody. There are technical questions, and some of which I'm sympathetic with. I'm not sure I want all 18-year-olds to get it. I'm not sure what they do with it, et cetera, et cetera. So there are issues. It's not clear-cut, and as I said, it would be if the other subsidies were removed. And of course, we know what Congress likes to do with subsidies, which is increase them. So it would have to be pretty ironclad in that regard. But the sympathy for the poor worker without his job would, of course, be much less if he had the basic income. So again, I think there is something there that might be worth looking at, and other countries are beginning to look at it, and a couple of Scandinavians are even beginning to adopt it, and we will see how it works there. And finally, on Claude, just a couple of things. In the 1980s, there became a big fuss because Japan was then the great threat. And Japan was the one with the trade surplus. Japan was this. And among other things, the Japanese had built a better supercomputer than the U.S. They had a better TV, pixel, whatever it is, count, etc., and so on. The argument was that we have to have our own supercomputers for defense reasons. Nobody thought of the problem that if we had our own supercomputer that wasn't as good, that might hurt our defense. If there's a better supercomputer to be had, why shouldn't the military have it? It wasn't done, and we now have better supercomputers. And the same, by the way, on the TV screens, the ones that were in the lead in Japan did not. I think the best way to make sure we're in deficit in the communications and what have you, high-tech stuff, would be to put protection of some kind against the Chinese. I do believe in competition. I'm sure it isn't exactly optimal to have them do that, but I think they're hurting themselves far more than us. And the more the Chinese want to protect all of their own technology and make sure they only use that by 2025, the better off we are if we let everybody in our country use the best technology. It seems to me that that's the way out. So I'm sympathetic to the argument that, well, they don't play fair, and especially when it is a state enterprise. There are problems because they've sort of got unlimited resources from the government. But on the other hand, the protection is a solution. I really worry that we would do ourselves more harm than good by trying it. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Bob?
Yes. Well, we've talked a lot about the shortage of U.S. savings, et cetera, as an explanation for the capital inflow. I'll buy lunch for anyone on the panel or in the group who can identify a country that has increased its savings rate or diverted savings to the United States at its own cost to help finance the U.S. savings deficit.
That's it? Okay, good. How good a lunch? Claude?
Just one thing, we can talk about the industrial policy thing in a minute, but I will say that this is not my area, so I don't know the details here, but I would say, you said in passing, this is kind of ironic, about something doing with trade adjustment assistance and wage subsidies, whatever. If you look at the work of Michael Strain and other younger economists here, they are really moving in that direction. I'll leave to you and to them to get the details of that. But this is not an ironic thing to say any longer, I think, at AEI, if it ever were. Just a couple of other things. On Jeff's point about, I didn't mention this, the administration has launched, as you know, this investigation of IP theft. I'm a little skeptical there. We've had all these figures that have thrown around the last couple of years, $600 billion, I think an independent commission said that we've lost. I'm skeptical for this reason. You can't just, in the end, I applaud the administration for starting it, but you can't just say without some sort of factual basis where the intellectual property has been stolen. You look foolish in the world. I mean, the $600 billion or whatever it is a sunk cost as far as I'm concerned. We can't do much about that. What I don't see happening is that, as we did with the Chinese military, those 5 Chinese military officers 3 years ago, that we had chapter and verse of what they had done. And I don't think the administration is going to be able to come up with that. Certainly not if you turn to the USTR. To do something like that, you'd have to go to the FBI, the NSA, the CIA. You'd have to get underneath as to what it was happening. So I'm a little skeptical of us doing that. I should also say that others have argued, in terms of reciprocity, without arguing with Ann at the moment, that we should try to do this with other nations. I'm happy to do that, but I can't see it. And another thing that I didn't mention at the end was that the high-tech sector, the high-tech companies in the United States are deeply divided on this. And so whatever the U.S. government does, whether it's Trump or his successors, I think they will have to do it alone. You cannot expect the Googles of the world, the Apples of the world to step up here. It's going to have to be coming from the U.S. government itself as to whatever we do in terms of taking action against the Chinese measures. Thank you.
Thanks, Desmond.
Yeah, I'd just make 3 points. First, I'd very much agree with Anne, that if the United States economy is at 4% unemployment, it's difficult to see how much lower that employment can go. So if we do eliminate the trade deficit, we're not going to get more employment. What we're going to get is we're going to get the economy overheating. We're going to get the need for policies to bring down our level of consumption to be consistent with our level of employment. So I don't see it as generating jobs. I just think that what it might do is it might generate inflation, and we really want to avoid that. Just on the dollar issue, I'm not convinced. I mean, I don't know yet, whether the dollar is losing its safe haven status, but I think that there's a question mark rising there. But what it is very important is this is a very important question for the Federal Reserve, because what we've seen since the start of the year is the dollar's depreciated by 10%. We've seen monetary conditions now at the easiest level that they've been, because together with asset prices all being so buoyed, that I don't really get why the Fed is holding off on the next rate increase or, moving ahead more quickly with the wind down of the assets. I think I've been here before, the Fed getting behind the curve. Just the last point I'd make is I don't think that countries should have the right to choose how much it is that they save, as if they're operating in isolation. They're operating in a global system. I think that when a country like Germany runs a current account surplus of 8% of GDP, they're part of the problem. It's not just the United States that's got a problem on the deficit side, and that what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to get the Germans to move in the correct direction, help us correct these global imbalances by doing something, use the fiscal space that you've got. My view would be get out of the euro, but that's another issue, and not have everything on the deficit country to do all of the adjustment.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, all of us up here could have a whole lot of fun just talking to each other for the next half hour or more, but instead we're going to open the floor to your questions. And I just want to remind you of our rules. You'll have the first one in just a minute there, which is please wait for the microphone. We are being recorded here, and then you'll be preserved for posterity. If you wait for the microphone, tell us your name, please, and your affiliation, and then ask your question. If you feel an overwhelming urge to give a lecture before your question, At 1 minute, the chair will remind you that it's time to ask your question instead. So I have the first one here, and then we're going to come to you second.
Hi, it's Sean Donnan from the Financial Times. I just wanted to get at something that you haven't talked about here so far this morning. That's the issue of measuring trade flows and trade deficits, and the work that the OECD has been doing, for example, on trade and value added. The argument being that actually traditional measures of trade and trade deficits just are not up to it anymore. Just don't reflect the modern realities of global supply chains and the way things move around the world. So just, can you talk us through a little bit, that and how we should be thinking about that? Should we be paying attention to these numbers? Are these just old-fashioned measures that aren't up to it anymore?
Okay, anybody want to take that one up? Dan, you touched on that a little bit. How
Yeah.
about the measurements against today's reality?
Measurement's better, of course, when regulations aren't as strong, but that's a different issue. Obviously, there's a difference between value-added trade and so on. Less so for the United States than many other countries, simply because we're so big that we have a smaller fraction in trade. Singapore, last I looked at it some time ago, nonetheless, has its GDP or certainly it's the same different, its oil exports are 180% of GDP. Which is what tells you quickly what's wrong with measuring exports as gross value added and then measuring GDP as net value added. Yet you want to measure GDP as net value added. In the case of the auto parts, of course, part of what Mexico is exporting to the U.S. is the auto parts that go into automobiles, which if the U.S. were selling abroad elsewhere, it would be better. So there's clearly, conceptually, a very strong case, and the OECD is to be commended to work on it in that regard. On the other hand, especially for the United States, I am not persuaded it would make that much difference. It might change, the time series by a more or less proportionate amount over the time, but I don't think it would change the fundamental facts. Now, for some other countries, as I said, Singapore being a good example, it would make a huge difference, and there are some countries like that. And the effort is certainly well worth doing, and the effort is better, even more important, given that people do tend to say, oh, look, there's an import, that's hurting our economy, which, of course, isn't true in the first place. But having imports used in exports and showing that more clearly, I think would help the debate, so I'm all for it. Meanwhile, we don't have the numbers to do it as accurately as we'd like yet, and the OECD is in the lead on that, and I congratulate them.
What about with
Jeff,
China,
hey,
Anna?
Whoops, Angus, I got Jeff, then we'll come to you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
But just to clarify, the point about value-added chains and about computing value-added in global supply chains makes a big difference for the bilateral balances.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, the fact that we have such a big bilateral balance with China importing all the smartphones, most of the components in those smartphones come from Korea or the U.S. or somewhere else. So it makes a huge difference for the bilateral balances. But I've argued that we shouldn't care about the bilateral balances anyway, and it doesn't change the story for the overall trade balance. I think maybe that we're over-measuring the current account deficits for technical reasons, but I don't agree with the idea that this situation looks fundamentally different for what we should care about, which is the overall trade balance. If you'd pay attention to detailed attention, which is useful for other reasons, to the value-added chain.
Claude?
Jeff made the point I was going to make. The only thing I would say is that we do face politically the situation that is actually used. And it does help to make the point that you made, that China really is just an entrepot for all kinds of other parts, and it comes out, and it comes to the final product comes to the United States as if it were a Chinese export to the United States, when that really isn't true. It's good in the political sense, I think, even though I understand you don't want to get involved in any debates on bilateral trade deficits or surpluses.
Others? Okay, I had a question right here. Wait for the microphone, please. It's coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Great job by the panel. Hilda Ochoa, Strategic Investment Group. I'll start with a question, and then I'll have to explain why I'm asking the question. And the question is, why is the wonderful science of economics not understood the need and developed a system of balance sheet accounting to complement the income accounting that has been so well developed? And the reason why I'm asking the question is because as I hear all of you say so many good things, I am finding some huge missing links in your analysis and in some of your conclusions. And just to name two huge missing links, you're not accounting for human capital, appreciation and depreciation of human capital. When we have 1.2 million immigrants that come into the United States every year, that is actually equivalent to some major productive machinery having been gifted to us to start producing income immediately. That is equivalent to about $1 trillion of savings.
I'm going to
I
have
asked
to
the
ask
question
you.
already. I was
Ask the
explaining
question.
it.
No, but
Yeah.
we have time
Okay.
limits. You
And
can
the other one
make
is-
your second point quickly.
And
if
the
you
other
like.
one is financial capital. When you have 3 to 4 trillion of foreign profits parked overseas, they could be here. All of that is marked to market through price earnings ratios in the financial markets here. All of it is savings that is matching the production that's being put overseas, and it's reflected in exports or in imports in U.S. companies, because we do not measure assets and liabilities and mark them to market for the U.S. economy as a whole. We're missing those links.
Okay, thank you. How about balance
I'll be
sheets
happy.
and all this? Bob, I was going to say that this should be right up your alley.
I'll answer the first question and let the panel, I'll answer the second and let the panel deal with the first. So if Apple has a claim, Apple of Cupertino has a claim of $10 billion, has $10 billion of cash sitting in Limerick, that's a U.S. direct foreign investment. It's measured.
Other comments on balance sheets?
Yeah.
Ann?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, two things. One, we do have net investment position, which the IMF is putting out, which is something. And the interesting thing is the U.S. net investment position has become negative, but U.S. net earnings from foreign investment are still positive. So there's something in the measurement that's quite strange there. And I haven't seen, although I don't look carefully, but I haven't seen any explanation. On human capital, the big argument would be quite different. As to the other, one of the things we didn't mention today, and is relevant to what Bob Aliber was saying too, is that it is true that U.S. companies are holding a lot of dollars overseas because of the tax-exempt status of their profits when it's left overseas. And one of the interesting questions, long before you went to some kind of Tobin tax or anything like that, would be why not do something about the corporate profits tax so that you had made it more neutral and made it incentive neutral to bring profits back, and that would make a difference. So you're quite right about that one.
Any other comments from the panel? Okay, next question, right here, please. Hang on, wait for the microphones coming.
Thanks.
John Soliday, independent economist. I sense an incongruity between the full employment, reference to full employment, and Professor Aliber's point about these pockets of depression. And then there was a suggestion that we might guarantee wages, subsidize wages, or guarantee income. And I was wondering, and this goes back to Nick Eberstadt's work on low labor force participation and men without work, if indeed that is not the problem, and there might be a problem with providing income support with this issue of labor force participation and these people that have been pulled out. Now, the only reason I mention this is that people may tend to confuse trade issues with this underlying structural problem.
Okay, so you want to take that up? Jeff?
I mean, just to agree that when we say that we're at full employment or the natural rate of unemployment, we don't mean that 5% is as low as we would like it to be. Clearly, there is this problem that prime age males, white males, are out of the labor force, and whether you want to blame video games or the opioid crisis or alcoholism or what, there's clearly a problem, and it should be addressed. But macroeconomics can't address it. Monetary fiscal stimulus can't address it. Trade surplus can't address it.
Anybody else?
I would just like to speak briefly to that issue. So Desmond picked on me, and Desmond said, we're at full employment, what would happen if the trade deficit declines? So let's go down that route and follow that mental experiment. So why are we at full employment? Well, we have a current account deficit of 4% of GDP, and we have a large fiscal deficit. So in my sort of general equilibrium view, the trade deficit essentially has meant a loss of jobs, and we've essentially had to provide work for a number of people by having a larger fiscal deficit. I don't want any abrupt changes in the economy, but I'd like to get a sort of a gradual decline in the trade deficit, and that, in my general equilibrium model, would provide more jobs in the tradable goods sector and a smaller fiscal deficit. Thank you for the question.
Another question right here, please.
Danny Bachman, Deloitte. I would like the panelists to react to the fact that Chinese demographics, of course, are remarkable in the future. That essentially we're heading towards a China with a huge number of old people and no way to support them. So I'm wondering if you could reflect on this panel 20 years from now and how it would think about the Chinese surplus and whether Chinese balance surplus with the United States, and whether that's related to the fact that no one really talked about the Japanese surplus with the United States when 20 years ago that probably would have been the main topic.
We do have that interesting shift from our previous agonies about Japan. But how about Chinese demographics and how this works? Bob, and then we'll take anybody else who wants to comment.
I think this is just a great question, and we get great insights, I think, from the Japanese experience. So for the last 5 years, I've been predicting an implosion of the Chinese property price bubble. And the bastards keep pushing it off, but it's going to occur, just as it occurred in Japan. There is a massive property price bubble, and at that stage, what we will see happening will be that the Chinese demand for imports will decline very sharply. Chinese exports will surge. This is Japan, 1991, 1992, repleted. And China will have a massive trade surplus, and Washington will no longer be able to justify that large trade surplus because it's the biggest aircraft carrier that we have. So the trade issues are just going to become immensely intense when the combination of the surge, the excess supply of housing and the demographics hit.
Other comments on demographics somehow? Ann?
Yeah, I think one can outline that scenario, but there's another scenario, partly because the Chinese so far have not built that much of a pension system and so on. There's a lot more work to be done, which does explain part of the high savings rate in China. And if instead you go along that route, you would forecast that there's a decline there. Meanwhile, of course, their labor force is already constant. It's not rising anymore. So that in some sense, if there is an increase in some component of value added, unless they get the productivity growth up from where it is now, they'd have problems. And at the moment, they do not seem to be taking actions that, at least to me, suggest they're going to do much on the productivity side. So I would sort of say that the more likely thing in the near term is indeed what we've already seen a bit of, namely their surplus is going to diminish as the demand for some of these services domestically increases as the demographic composition changes. But I agree with Bob in the sense that there are both of these forces at work, and how they play out could be quite different just depending on. But my own guess is, based on reading what little I've read on it, that indeed the pressure for the more social services, the more old age assistance and so on, will outweigh the pressure the other way, which Bob is thinking about.
Thank you. Desmond, then we'll come to you, Jeff.
Yeah, I think, you're pointing to...
You obviously had a stimulating question.
You're pointing to a very important issue, in terms of demographics and how it affects savings. To the extent that it affects savings, what we've been saying before is that that is going to have an impact on current account balances, because it's going to impact the savings, not necessarily the investment, so you'd get that change. But the point I'd make is that when you're looking at this from a question of how's it going to affect that particular country's current account balance, you've got to take into account that demographics are going on in other countries as well. So you've got many countries that are aging at rapid rates, and I guess I would think that the country that's going to have its current account hit the most through this means is the country that is aging at the most rapid rate. So I'd be really concerned. I don't know about China as much as I'm concerned about Japan, because Japan's got this huge amount of debt, public debt. They're still running a big fiscal deficit, and their population is aging like crazy. So you'd imagine that as in the same way as when they were anticipating their retirement, they saved a lot, but once they're in the retirement, they begin to dissave. So you could really get big movements, I would think, in Japan over the next few years.
Jeff?
Well, I agree with what the others have said. I mean, by the way, the two countries that are looking forward, aging the most rapidly in the world, are Korea and Singapore. And I think you will see that the effect that as people retire, the saving rate will come down and their current account surpluses will come down. And I think also with China, I agree with Ann that China should develop its pension system and social safety net system more. Just to crystallize it, I agree very much with the Japanese, with the precedent, and I think it's already happened, Desmond. In the 80s, when everyone was so upset about the Japanese surpluses, we economists gave them the same speeches about national saving and investment, and audiences were skeptical. It just seemed so abstract, like, okay, maybe in a textbook somewhere, an ivory tower somewhere, but surely the reason Japan is running such large current account surpluses and trade surpluses, they said, has to do with semiconductors and trade negotiations. And we just can't believe it's driven by savings and investment. Mm-hmm. The prediction was, at that time, we already knew that Japan was the most rapidly aging country in the world. As they aged and retired, the saving rate would come down and the current account surplus would come down. That is what has happened over the last 30 years. People forget what we were said in the 80s, but I think economists had it right. And I think the same, no, we're not always right. Not everything works out that well, but on this one, I think we got it right. And I think the same thing is true of these other countries.
Thank you.
Just
Okay, Bob, go ahead, and then we're going to go to the next question.
in terms just of the Japanese experience, there was an immediate short-term experience when asset prices fell, and that led to a surge in the current account. Right, and in the China case, when property prices fall, household net worth is going to decline by 50%, and it is predictable that there will be a massive increase in the savings rate.
I want to take the privilege of the next question myself, and this is from my good friend Bob. Bob, do you share Desmond's concern about the potential loss of safe haven status for the American securities markets and of the U.S. dollar?
No,
and that's why you like your tax.
It's premature, Desmond.
Premature?
We'll come back to the issue in 20 years.
Yes, I have a contract.
My question is, what would be the alternative? Would there be I mean, it's not going to be China. Where else would you go?
Well, they are going to places like the euro or to the Swiss franc or to the Japanese yen.
You've just given a release of Japan. That's not a great place to go.
Well, it might be telling us how bad the markets are thinking about the United States.
But the other side, and I am somewhat worried. The other side is that if indeed the kind of infrastructure expenditures and tax reductions, et cetera, that are proposed comes into effect. Already there's, at least from what I've heard and seen overseas, a fair amount of greater concern about the stability of the United States than there was. And if inflation begins taking off here, as given that we are close to full employment now, could well happen. In fact, the latest consumer is 2.4% for last month, which is the CPI is higher than it's been in a long time. And if that's taking off right now, and then that came in, I can well imagine that people might not necessarily decide, okay, I'll take it out of dollars and put it into yen or whatever, but I can well imagine that they'll decide to keep it in their home currency rather than putting it in dollars. And especially in countries where indeed there's some basis, as for example Germany, to believe that there will be stability. And right now there is still a lot of holding within Europe of U.S. dollar assets as well as other countries holding dollar assets. And we need to have we need to have some increase in that holding to sort of hold our macro together, and if that stops, it's already concerned, and once that stops, and it's concerned, then that there'd be a reversal and getting out. Could happen. As always, when these things happen, it's not something that happens slowly, it happens quickly over the precipice.
Okay, other questions from you all? Right here, please.
Hi, Vilas Pathikonda from Public Citizen. I wanted to see if I could get some of the panelists to respond to the contention over here a little bit more clearly about crowding in, crowding out, in terms of the S-I being not independent of foreign demand of U.S. securities. Why don't we hear economists maybe talk about that? If you do agree, why don't we hear economists maybe talk about that a little bit more?
Okay, other questions on crowding in, crowding out? I mean, other comments?
No one
Bob,
has,
that-
no one has
that's you.
taken me up on my offer of lunch.
Well, did you mean a country that has voluntarily decreased savings to do the U.S. a favor? Is that what your price of lunch is?
No. But so, in all of these sort of scenarios, the United States is the bad guy. We drink too much, we save too little, et cetera, et cetera. And the Lone Ranger from Switzerland or Asia comes to the rescue and sends us savings. So that country has either increased its savings rate or it's reallocated more savings to the United States at a cost to its domestic residents. Name the country for a free lunch.
Anyway, I think the bottom line is when the U.S. is at natural rate of employment, whether you think that it's a low U.S. savings or high foreign savings or tariffs or whatever you think it is, it's not going to affect, increasing the trade surplus from here on will not improve employment and growth. You just have to take the resources away from somewhere else. We're up against a constraint. It was true as of the turn of the century, 2000, and it's true again now.
And to add to that, of course, and as was pointed out earlier by the panel, if indeed somehow by some miracle Congress did decide indeed to do something today that did somehow, as Bob wants us to do, to cut the trade deficit, of course that makes a difference. But that makes a difference because the trade deficit is cut, and it's not going to come out in the form probably of anything like you're wanting. It's instead going to come out in the form of less inflation than we will have, because we have this much demand already in the system, and these higher taxes or lower taxes and more infrastructure will put increased pressure for price increases. So I would guess the true alternative right now is to get some degree of correction in the aggregate demand relative to supply balance in the U.S., or we're going to have more inflation in the near future. We've been looking for some time at this, but it's just beginning now, and I think even the Fed is beginning to look at all the increased inflationary pressures.
Just go back to
excuse me.
Oh, I'm
No,
sorry.
go ahead. No,
I
I have a
I
question.
keep
so
preempting
finish
you.
that.
Go ahead.
No, go
Claude,
ahead.
go ahead, Claude, and then we'll get
I have a question, so go ahead and finish this.
No, I'm just going to amplify that point, go back to the 1990s. Why was that the longest expansion in U.S. history? Part of it was the Fed allowed it to run without raising interest rates, and part of the reason they were able to do that is they didn't worry about inflation, and part of the reason they didn't worry about inflation is we had this safety valve, this high rate of demand. Instead of getting overheating the economy and resulting in inflation, high imports and low prices for imports kept inflation down, and they were able to let the recession, let the growth run for longer. And I think we may be back in that situation again.
I just have a question, just in terms of future trade policy around the world. In terms of all the things we've talked about this morning, in terms of the savings or investment, the aging of populations, various other macroeconomic large issues, what impact is any of this going to have on, let's say, the next 10 years in world trade policy, whether it's the WTO or will it move or not nations to go in bilateral, as the Trump people want to do, or has it any implication at all from what you see?
Okay, Claude, that's a great big picture question for us, and we're going to end on it, giving the other panelists a chance. What about the whole global regime of trade, and as we look over the next decade, either comments on what will happen or what should happen?
Well, it seems to me that at the moment, given what we think we hear the president saying about trade protectionism, if he is able to and follows that route to anything like even an intermediate degree, namely he doesn't necessarily have to fulfill every promise completely, but he goes protectionist and the U.S. goes protectionist. I think that is going to be far more important in driving trade policy in the rest of the world over the next 10 years than these other things we've talked about, simply because we were, to our credit, at least before this, the leader in opening up the trading system to everybody's benefit. And if now we retreat, there is no obvious natural successor in terms of the hegemon who could lead the process in the short run, I regret to say. Some countries are beginning to try and adopt their policy and to change it and to try and put together coalitions that might work. But so far, I don't see anything that offers a lot of promise to offset the... People want to be protectionist. There's something in human nature that wants it, rightly or wrongly. And if the U.S. turns more protectionist, that will become another argument for protection in other countries. And so I think that's far more important than the demographic. It's far more important. Chinese surplus is going down. That's not changing things. That's not the argument that people are having right now.
Desmond? Let's give Jeff a moment, and then Desmond, as the organizer in chief, we're going to give you the last word.
Well, as the organizer, I might override you.
I agree. It's very worrisome. And we used to have this bicycle theory that if trade policy didn't keep moving forward, that we would fall over and move backward. And it's happening. I'm not sure if that theory is right, but I would be happy if we could just stay where we were. And instead, I worry that we're falling over or moving backward. I also think it's part of a more general pattern of a U.S. abdication of leadership in the world, not because we can't afford it. People used to say maybe we won't be able to afford it. We can afford it. That's not the issue at all. But amazingly, we're throwing it away with both hands for no good reason, just because we don't understand. And I think it applies not just to trade, but it applies to international finance. It applies to national security. It applies to science. It applies to the climate agreements and so on.
Desmond, last word.
Yeah. Well, I hate to end on a down note.
You would be out of character otherwise.
An up one then.
Well, where have you been?
What I would just observe is that it has to be of concern that we've got these kind of trade frictions at a time that we're experiencing a synchronized global recovery. That employment looks good in a lot of places, the world is getting on. So the question you have to ask is, what happens if the central banks, through their huge amount of monetary easing over the past 8 years, they've increased their balance sheets by like $10 trillion. What they've done is they've created an asset price bubble. Greenspan's talking about a bond bubble. Schiller's talking about equity prices being at elevated values. There's a huge amount of credit mispricing. There are a lot of fault lines in the global economy. You've got to ask, if we've got problems now in terms of trade frictions, what's going to happen during the next downturn? And it looks to me as if what the central banks have done is they've set the stage for another major downturn going ahead. So on that happy note, I thank you for all coming.
Thank you, Desmond. Thank you for coming, and let's show our appreciation for the panel.
Good deal. Well, that's just because